On the 7th of May 1942, two Imperial Japanese Navy task groups were steaming south from the Japanese base at Withdrawal. They were headed for the Coral Sea. Close to the coast of Papua, a force of 11 transports steamed at a lazy 8 knots. On board were the 5,000-strong, veteran South Seas Force. Their destination, the last major Allied base to the north of Australia, Port Moresby. Built around the 144th Infantry Regiment with supporting engineer and artillery regiments, the South Seas Force had been the spearhead of Japan's southern offensive operations in early 1942. They were veterans of the Wake Island and Withdrawal operations. Port Moresby was the key to the Allied position in the southwest Pacific area. Essentially the only developed settlement in the Australian territory of Papua, the town was quickly becoming a key Allied airbase. If it could be captured by the Japanese, the keystone of their southern defensive perimeter, Withdrawal, would be all the more secure. Without a foothold in Papua, any Allied counterattack would have to be staged from Australia itself, and the Japanese would be able to put severe pressure on northeastern Australia. In accordance with the orders issued on the 29th of January, the Imperial General Headquarters viewed the capture of Port Moresby as the primary objective of operations in the southwest Pacific sector. On the morning of the 7th, the amphibious force, escorted by the light carrier Shoho, 1 light cruiser and 5 destroyers, was approaching the very tip of Papua, where they would make a hard right turn and enter the Coral Sea. Under the command of Admiral Inoue, operating in a far cover position 600 kilometers to their west were the Japanese ships of the 5th Aircraft Carrier Division, spearheaded by the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. Several hundred kilometers to the south of the Japanese formations, under the command of Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, 3 Allied task forces were steaming to intercept. Task Forces 17 and 11 were based on the 2 US carriers, Lexington and Yorktown, in addition to their escorts. The third, Task Force 44, which was composed of the cruisers HMAS Australia, HMAS Hobart and USS Chicago, plus a pair of destroyers, had been detached with the aim of intercepting the Port Moresby invasion force. At dawn, the American carriers launched several scout aircraft, and by 8:30 they had located the Japanese task force. The Battle of the Coral Sea had begun. Over the following 2 days, waves of carrier aircraft exchanged heavy blows. The first day of the battle went well for the Allies. As the Japanese invasion force was detected first, it was hit badly on the morning of the 7th. The light carrier Shoho was swarmed by the combined air groups of Lexington and Yorktown. Hit by 13 1,000-pound bombs and 7 torpedoes, the carrier was blown to pieces with the loss of 631 men. Fearing additional air attacks, the invasion force steamed north, retreating from the battle. But the Japanese fleet carriers remained undetected. At 8:20 AM on the following morning, the pilot of a Dauntless dive bomber looked through a hole in the clouds to see the 2 Japanese flat tops, Shokaku and Zuikaku. An hour later, the flight decks of Yorktown and Lexington buzzed with the launching of strike aircraft. However, the Japanese bombers were already on their way. 2 waves of American aircraft reached the Japanese carriers at 10:57 and 11:30, scoring 3 devastating bomb hits on Shokaku. Although still seaworthy, the Japanese carrier was badly damaged and incapable of further flight operations. At 11:13, the Japanese aircraft struck. 18 torpedo planes and 33 dive bombers fell on the pair of American carriers. Through rapid turns, Yorktown was able to evade the torpedo bombers, although she did take minor damage from a 250-kilogram bomb. Lexington did not fare so well. Caught in a pincer between 2 groups of strike aircraft, she was hit by a pair of Type 95 torpedoes, followed closely by 2 bomb hits. Although both carriers were damaged, they were able to conduct flight operations. After receiving the returning aircraft, a fire broke out on board Lexington, which soon became uncontrollable. Rocked by a series of devastating explosions, at 5 o'clock her crew began to abandon ship. With his carrier force now badly depleted, Fletcher decided to withdraw. Although Zuikaku was undamaged and the Japanese invasion force was largely intact, the Japanese air group had been savaged by the day's fighting. With only 24 Zeros, 8 dive bombers and 4 torpedo planes operational, it was clear that the 5th Carrier Division could not provide cover to the invasion force. Inoue had detected the cruisers of Task Force 44, which were now in a position to intercept the invasion force, and without a potent carrier air wing, he was not confident in his ability to protect the amphibious formation. At 2:30 he postponed the Port Moresby operation and ordered all Japanese naval forces to retreat. The South Seas Detachment headed back to Withdrawal. Imperial General Headquarters had intended to launch a second amphibious assault against Port Moresby after the Midway operation had been completed. But with the destruction of the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu and Soryu at the battle, any hope of a large-scale amphibious operation in the Port Moresby area had vanished. Without carrier protection, there was no way the full strength of the South Seas force could be risked in a seaborne operation in the Coral Sea again, especially in the face of growing Allied air power which was operating from Port Moresby and northern Australia. Nevertheless, the importance of the airbase at Port Moresby was only growing by the month. On July the 7th, the IJN's operations section urged the cancellation of the wider Fiji and New Caledonia offensive, codenamed Operation FS, arguing that the capture of Port Moresby had to be the primary objective in the area. As more and more Allied aircraft began operating from the airbase, the air war in New Guinea became highly attritional, with constant attacks forcing the Japanese into nearly daily air combat. Port Moresby was within range of many vital Japanese positions in the Bismarck archipelago, including their main base at Rabaul, meaning their thinly stretched air units were constantly forced to engage Allied fighters. Even if the Zeros did well, these kinds of attritional battles were not to the Japanese advantage, as the Allies could replace aircraft at a much higher rate. Without the airbase at Port Moresby, it would be much harder for the Allies to effectively deploy their air power. Given the continued strategic significance of the base, attention immediately turned to a possible land advance towards Port Moresby. On the 18th of May, just after the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese 17th Army was activated. With its headquarters at Davao, the 17th Army would be responsible for operations in the New Guinea, Papua and Solomon Island regions, and with the abortive amphibious operation now over, the South Seas Detachment now came under 17th Army Command. Within weeks, the Imperial General Headquarters began proposing an overland attack on Port Moresby. Prince Takeda, a member of the Imperial Royal Family, showed the staff of the 17th Army a translation of a book written by an English explorer, who mentioned a road from the north coast of Papua, across the towering Owen Stanley Range, down to the coastal plain around Port Moresby. Amazingly, based on virtually this intelligence alone, the Imperial General Headquarters ordered the 17th Army to immediately cease all other operations and begin a feasibility study for the advance from the north coast of Papua towards Port Moresby. On July the 1st, after conferring with 4th Fleet Command, Lieutenant General Harakichi Hayakatake, the commander of the 17th Army, issued the following order to the South Seas Detachment. The Army will carry out the necessary reconnaissance for a land attack against Port Moresby. The South Seas Detachment commander will land a force in the vicinity of Buna. This force will advance rapidly to the pass over the Owen Stanley Range south of Kokoda and reconnoitre roads for an overland advance on Port Moresby by the main body of the detachment. A report of this reconnaissance will be made as soon as possible. Although the original plans for the reconnaissance operation, now code-named RI or RI, were still being made, less than 2 weeks later the Imperial General Headquarters directed the 17th Army to capture Port Moresby. It was clear that Tokyo had already decided upon an overland advance, whether there was a road or not. This development led to an updated order from General Hayakatake on the 11th of June. The Army, in cooperation with the Navy, will promptly effect the capture of Port Moresby and strategic points in eastern New Guinea. The South Seas Detachment will speedily land at Buna, push forward on the Buna-Kokoda Road, and capture Port Moresby and adjacent airfields. It was clear to everyone that the South Seas Detachment was going to march across the Owen Stanley Range from the north shore of Papua, whether it was a sound tactical idea or not. Preliminary reconnaissance had shown that the roads around the coastal town of Buna were good. About 100 kilometers inland of Buna, on the foothills of the mountains, sat the small village of Kokoda with its grass airstrip. There was clearly a visible road from Buna to Kokoda, but beyond that, aerial reconnaissance could see nothing but jungle and mountains. When summoned to Davao to receive his orders, Major General Horii, the South Seas Detachment's commander, was unenthusiastic about the prospects for a successful advance across the Owen Stanley Mountains. He outlined his main concerns to the 17th Army Command, which were logistical. The problem is securing supplies. This would not be an issue if there was a road suitable for motor transport. However, without so much as a pack-horse trail, all supplies would need to be transported by human carriers. The current number of men on the front line would be approximately 5,000. Given the average daily food requirement of 600 grams per person, this would result in a daily supply requirement for the detachment amounting to 3 tons. If each man could carry 25 kilograms of supplies, this would limit a day's march in the mountains to 20 kilometers. Securing the daily 3-ton supply for the detachment would require approximately 230 carriers per day reaching the front line. This amounts, in total, given the 20-day round trip, to a requirement of approximately 4,600 carriers. If the front were to advance to Port Moresby, some 360 kilometers distant from Buna, then to supply food alone would require 32,000 carriers. If one considers munitions and other supplies, the requirement for carriers would be immense. Ultimately, the overland route is probably not possible unless a road for motor transport can be pushed out from Buna. Lieutenant General Hayakutake was unmoved by these concerns. The decision had already been made. The Imperial General Headquarters had formulated a new joint Army-Navy operational plan to take Port Moresby. The South Seas Detachment, reinforced by other elements of the 17th Army, would land at Buna, advance to Kokoda, and gain a foothold on the southern slopes of the Owen Stanley Range. In a concurrent Navy operation, a special naval landing force of Japanese Marines would attack and secure the airbase at Milne Bay. Once that airbase was secured, a smaller amphibious force would land elements of the 35th Infantry Brigade in the area around Port Moresby. With the new beachhead secured, Port Moresby would be taken in a simultaneous attack from the land and the sea. It was an operational plan that looked good on paper, a dramatic pincer attack with concurrent amphibious and land operations. However, if there was no road from Kokoda to Port Moresby, as General Horii could already see, then the Japanese men would starve. Additionally, given the reasonably small naval forces available, if the Australian resistance was greater than the Imperial General Headquarters assumed, then the Milne Bay operation was likely to fail. Despite these obvious concerns, Tokyo had clearly made its decision. One can almost feel the creeping desperation in the Japanese general staff. After the absolute disaster at Midway, this was the only chance they had to take Port Moresby, which was, by far, the most important Allied base in the Southwest Pacific area. The Japanese land forces which had been amassed for the advance on Port Moresby were substantial. The spearhead would be the elite South Seas Detachment. Veterans of operations in China, Wake Island and Rabaul, the 5,000-strong detachment was optimized for jungle operations, with attached engineer and mountain gun units. In support of the South Seas Detachment, the 17th Army allocated the 41st Infantry Regiment, veterans of the Malaya and Philippines campaigns. Including the 35th Infantry Brigade force, which was allocated to amphibious operations, this brought the total Japanese strength for the Port Moresby advance to 9 battalions. This is in addition to the several thousand Marines which would be deployed to Milne Bay. To put this force into perspective, more Japanese battalions were assigned to the advance on Port Moresby than were initially deployed to Guadalcanal. On the 20th of July, the operation commenced. Under the command of Rear Admiral Matsuyama, an invasion force departed Rabaul. Covered by the light cruisers Tenryu and Tatsuta, and a number of escorting destroyers and submarine chasers, on board 3 fast transports was the main force of the Yokoyama Advance Party, a battalion-sized element of the South Seas Force. Under the command of Colonel Yokoyama was the 1st Battalion of the 144th Infantry Regiment and the 1st Battalion of the 55th Mountain Artillery Regiment. As the name suggests, this force was intended to be the advanced party and would secure the Buna area and reconnoitre the roads to Kokoda. Attached to this formation were several IJN land forces, including anti-aircraft batteries and the 15th Base Establishment Unit, whose orders were to rapidly establish an airbase at Buna. At 5 PM on the 21st of July, the Japanese forces landed at 2 beaches in the Buna and Gona area unopposed, and the naval units rapidly began construction activities. The next morning the beachhead was savaged by waves of Allied aircraft staged from Port Moresby. A B-17 struck the fast transport Ayatsusan Maru, which was later abandoned due to uncontrolled fires. Despite the best efforts of Allied aircraft, within 3 days the Japanese base at Buna was established. The lead elements of the Yokoyama Advance Party quickly began advancing towards Kokoda. They found the road network in the Buna area to be in good condition and were able to use motor transport. The lead elements rapidly advanced towards Kokoda, and by the 26th of July, the main body was concentrated on the high ground at Oivi, about 16 kilometers to the west of the village. The importance of taking Port Moresby was only underlined by the strength of Allied air power in Papua. In the open areas around Kokoda, the advance force was hit by several air attacks, forcing them to move at night. In the evening, the whole battalion attacked an entrenched company of Australian infantry at the village of Kokoda itself. After losing 21 killed in action, including a company commander, the Japanese compelled the Australian forces to withdraw into the mountains. The Japanese had secured the village and its airstrip. The small village of Kokoda, after which the whole campaign would be named, sits in the Mambar River Valley at an altitude of about 1,000 feet. The valley itself is the last area of open terrain between the north and south coasts. Beyond Kokoda lay the fearsome Owen Stanley Mountains. The range cuts Papua in two, effectively isolating the north and south coasts. From the village of Kokoda itself, the towering peak of Mount Victoria can be seen, rising 4,000 metres above the surrounding jungle. To the east and west of this great mountain was nothing but wilderness, precipitous valleys and hillsides covered in dense rainforest and jungle. There were no roads through the mountains, only single-file mud tracks cut into the hillsides, linking the few tiny mountain villages. At its lower slopes, the Owen Stanleys are blanketed by thick, sweltering, malaria-infested jungle. But at higher altitudes, the mountain peaks are often covered in snow and the passes are blanketed in frigid rain. These mountains were, truly, some of the most treacherous and unforgiving terrain over which battle would be fought in the Second World War. The Australian units operating around Kokoda were companies of the 39th Battalion. Perhaps the most famous single infantry unit in Australian military history, for many Australians the story of the Kokdoa Track Campaign is synonymous with the exploits of this one infantry battalion. But the 39th Battalion was not an all-volunteer, elite formation of the Australian Imperial Force, units which had won such great fame in the Great War and were building an equal reputation in the Western Desert. Rather, the 39th was a relatively poorly trained militia battalion, partially composed of conscripts and with practically no combat experience. It would be up to this lowly battalion to face the elite South Seas force in the fearsome rainforest of the Owen Stanley Mountains. But to understand why the defence of Australia's last bastion beyond its own shores rested upon the shoulders of these militiamen, rather than its elite, battle-hardened formations, we need to appreciate the wider strategic circumstances facing the nation in 1942. At the beginning of the war against Germany, Australia's general military policy was simply to repeat the strategy Canberra had employed during the Great War. To aid Great Britain and the defence of the Empire, an expeditionary force would be raised and deployed to Europe. It was only legal under Australian law for volunteer forces to fight overseas. Nonetheless, there was a need for conscription to generate larger forces for home defence. Because of these legal constraints, the Australian Army was effectively split in half. During the Great War, the Australian Army units that fought in Europe were called the Australian Imperial Force, or AIF. In honour of the great achievements Australian fighting men achieved during the War of 1914 to 1918, it was decided to raise the Australian Imperial Force again. However, in order to keep the legacy independent, the new formation was called the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, or 2AIF. As the battalions were raised in this new AIF, their numbers started again. So, to distinguish these units, a 2 was placed in front of their battalion or regiment number. This makes the 1st Battalion, 2nd Australian Imperial Force, the 2nd 1st Battalion. Obviously this can be confusing, but all one needs to remember is AIF formations have a 2 in front of their battalion or regiment number. By 1941, 5 AIF divisions had been raised, the 6th, 7th, 8th and 9th, which were all standard British pattern infantry divisions, and the 1st Armoured Division. The 6th, 7th and 9th divisions were all deployed to North Africa, and the 8th formed the foundation of the Singapore garrison. The 1st Armoured Division remained in Australia for home defence. The other half of the Australian Army were the Citizen Military Forces, or CMF, which are generally known as the militia. Unlike the AIF, as these formations contained conscripts, they could not be deployed overseas. However, it is incorrect to think of CMF units as conscript formations. Many men who, for example, wanted to serve in the army but did not want to be deployed to Europe joined the CMF. Although often derided by members of the elite AIF, given enough training and equipment, CMF divisions could acquit themselves very well. But before Pearl Harbor, the role of the CMF was not treated with the seriousness it deserved. At its core, the militia had a cadre of excellent and battle-experienced officers who had all seen extensive action in the Great War, although these men tended to be a little older than their AIF equivalents. At the beginning of the war, the CMF had a paper strength of 4 infantry divisions and 2 cavalry divisions, although these were at a low state of combat readiness and not at full strength. For the first 2 years, priority was given to the AIF. The best regular officers from the Australian Army and the lion's share of the armament all went to divisions that were deployed overseas. CMF units were identical in structure to AIF equivalents. Standard divisions were composed of 9 battalions in 3 infantry brigades, in addition to artillery and other elements, and each infantry battalion contained 4 rifle companies of just over 100 men each. With the destruction of the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and the devastating defeat at Singapore, which included the loss of the whole 8th Division, Australian leadership began to appreciate the dire strategic circumstance the nation now faced. The possibility of an invasion of Australia and its territories was now very real, and Australia's primary fighting formations were all in North Africa. In response to this desperate situation, the Australian Army embarked upon the greatest expansion in its history. The mobilisation was rapid. By April 1942, the 6 standing CMF divisions were all brought up to full strength, and a further 2, the 5th and 10th divisions, were raised. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Australian Army was now over 500,000 strong. Although the rapid expansion had strained Australia's resources, the new units immediately led to a shortfall of key weapons and munitions. Australian industry was surging. 12,000 rifles, 300 Bren guns and 80 25-pounder artillery pieces were being produced every month, enough to equip a whole division, and by mid-1942 all of these formations would be adequately armed. Therefore, by July, General Douglas MacArthur, the Southwest Pacific Area Supreme Allied Commander, had a very large land force under his command. In mainland Australia, he had 9 Australian divisions, 2 of them motorised, 1 armoured, and when the AIF headed home that would swell to 12. Additionally, there were 2 American divisions under his command, the 32nd and 41st, for a total of 14. This force was essentially an army group. The problem, however, was time to effectively train these newly mobilised CMF formations. The Australian Army had an internal grading system for the combat readiness of different divisions and brigades based on the amount of training they had received. Units were graded at A through F. The lowest grade, F, designated units that had not completed basic training. At 30 weeks of total training time, units achieved a D rating. These formations were certified for static defensive roles only and still required much higher levels of brigade-level exercises. Only after 11 months of total training time with full equipment did a brigade achieve a B rating, denoting the completion of all high-level training and certifying the formation for full mobile offensive operations. A was reserved for combat-experienced units. None of the Australian CMF formations in Port Moresby had achieved B status by July 1940. The 39th Battalion had been raised in October 1941, and although much of its establishment was composed of transferees from other units, by January 1942, just 3 months later, the battalion was deployed to Papua. The 39th was a Victorian battalion, raised primarily from the industrial city of Melbourne. It was joined by the 53rd Battalion, which had been formed in Sydney. The story of the 53rd Battalion is one of almost criminal negligence. Although some of the battalion was in basic training in October, by January the unit was rushed to Port Moresby with the 39th. As its establishment was short by around 100 personnel at embarkation, this shortfall was filled with freshly recruited conscripts. These men, generally 18 years old, were pulled off the streets of Sydney and ordered to board the transport. Many of them had barely fired a rifle before. Upon arrival at Port Moresby, the 39th and 53rd Battalions, along with the 49th Battalion which had been in Papua for several months, formed the 30th Brigade. Although there was ample time to continue training around Port Moresby, these formations spent most of their time on airbase construction and other tasks. In May, they were reinforced by the 14th Brigade, another CMF formation, but this unit was at an even lower level of training than the 30th Brigade. At its dispatch, it was given a D rating, certifying it for static defensive duties only. But upon arrival, this was reduced to an E, the lowest level possible for any trained unit. The decision to send such inexperienced formations to Papua is certainly hard to comprehend given the very clear evidence of the Japanese intention to take Port Moresby. By July 1942, there were 3 combat-experienced brigades available, and as time progressed, the CMF formations in Australia were reaching a full level of training. As an example, the well-trained 7th Brigade performed just as well as the AIF units which fought alongside it at the Battle of Milne Bay. The primary rationale behind sending D-rated infantry brigades to Port Moresby was that they were only ever intended to man the beach defences. The Australian High Command viewed an attack across the Owen Stanley Range as impossible. Yes, you could physically walk across the track that ran to Kokoda, but without supply by air, the logistical constraints would eventually become crushing. Thus, there would probably be no need for formations capable of mobile operations. As Japanese intentions began to become clearer, Major General Horii, the Australian commander in Papua, outlined the fundamental Australian strategy for the forthcoming campaign. Therefore, even if the Japanese do make this very difficult and impracticable move, let us meet them on ground of our own choosing and as close as possible to our own base. Let us merely help their own supply problem to strangle them, while reducing our own supply difficulties to a minimum. Nevertheless, Horii was ordered by MacArthur to deploy some forces across the mountains to Kokoda, with the aim of holding the airstrip there, and on the 15th of July they were airlifted in. Nonetheless, it was clear that Allied command was taken by surprise by the movement of the Yokoyama advance party to Kokoda. Even if the Australian generals thought an advance across the Kokdoa Track was foolhardy and likely to fail, the Japanese were determined to prove them wrong. After an abortive counterattack on the Kokoda airfield, which briefly succeeded in retaking half of the strip, the 39th Battalion, now codenamed Maroubra Force, began moving up the Kokdoa Track to Isurava. After 2 weeks of inactivity, the young men of the 39th Battalion, the average age of one section was only 18, had largely recovered from the initial fighting around Kokoda. The new battalion commander, Major Cameron, decided upon a counterattack. With the battalion concentrated, he led 31 officers and 433 men down the track from the mountains towards Kokoda. The attack initially went well. One of Cameron's companies was able to ambush a large party of Japanese infantry along the Oivi track, but was later forced to withdraw in the face of strong counterattacks. Around Kokoda itself, 2 companies were able to retake large parts of the village. The Australians were in good defensive positions on high ground with cleared fields of fire, and proved surprisingly difficult to dislodge. A vigorous attack on the morning of the 9th was stopped cold in the face of the Australian fighting positions. For the rest of the day, the Japanese persisted in trying to take the hill, but to no avail. As night fell, they switched to infiltration tactics. A Japanese officer wrote in his diary, "Commenced an attack at 10:20, advanced stealthily on hands and knees and gradually moved in closer to the enemy. Suddenly encountered enemy guards in the shadow of large rubber trees. Corporal Hamada killed one of them with the bayonet and engaged the others, but the enemy's fire forced us to withdraw." The morning of the 10th of August found the companies of the 39th Battalion still holding their defensive position around the village, but with the persistent Japanese attacks, ammunition was running low. After stopping an assault estimated to be 200 strong, at 5 PM, the Australian companies began a staggered withdrawal back towards Isurava. As was typical, the Japanese pressed them hard, making it very difficult to break contact, but eventually the battalion made it back to Isurava. The militiamen had fought extremely well. Given the amount of training they had received, holding off Yokoyama force for over 2 days of continuous battle was quite an achievement. Back on the 24th of July, Lieutenant General Hayakutake arrived in Rabaul. Although General Horii still had serious reservations about operations through the Owen Stanleys, very optimistic reports came in from Colonel Yokoyama. On his estimation, if the individual Japanese soldier could carry 12 days' worth of food, 4 days' march to Kokoda on good roads, and the 8 days through the mountains, they would have enough food to make the journey to Port Moresby. 17th Army Command was overjoyed at this report. However, it was only based on how long it would take a typical Papuan villager to walk the Kokdoa Track. Any resistance at all would immediately impact the Japanese supply situation. Thus, the command was given. On the 17th of August, Major General Horii alerted his officers, and the main body of the South Seas Force departed Rabaul, followed a week later by the 41st Regiment. By the 21st of August, Horii had a formidable force concentrated at Buna, over 13,000 men, 10,000 of which were a balanced and highly capable combat force. Indeed, he still had a final battalion to come. These men were battle-hardened veterans, and the units they constituted were of exceptionally high quality. Jungle warfare specialists equipped with mountain guns and dedicated engineer elements. Waiting for them at Isurava, a pass in the Owen Stanley Mountains, were just over 2,000 Australians, half of them not rated by their own army as suitable for the battle they were about to fight. That was all that stood between Horii and Port Moresby. Both sides began conscripting Papuan men as porters. As Papua was an Australian-mandated territory, all Papuans were liable to be conscripted. Under Australian law, Papuans who served the military were paid a wage in cash, between 5 and 10 shillings a month for unskilled labour, and there were specific restrictions on how many men could be conscripted from an area, although during this time of emergency the last limit was lifted. Food and clothing was also to be provided. Thousands of Papuans were mobilised for logistical operations along the Kokoda Track, and there were even some Papuan combat units fighting alongside the 39th Battalion. The Japanese, conversely, paid Papuan men with the bayonet. The Japanese official history details this episode with almost comical understatement. Approximately 2,000 natives were also commandeered. This action had unfavourable repercussions for occupation administration and for later attempts to indoctrinate and pacify the local populace. Operational demands, however, took precedence. There are accounts of Japanese rape, torture and murder of native Papuans all throughout the Papua and New Guinea campaigns. For example, at Milne Bay, the advancing Australian forces found the mutilated bodies of numerous Papuans, men and women. The indiscriminate and unwanted Japanese cruelty to the local population is hard to understand. Perhaps they were trying to desensitize their fighting men to the act of killing. Whatever the justification was, the people of Papua suffered greatly under Japanese occupation. Often an untold part of the story, the reality is the Kokdoa Track Campaign was fought on the backs of the men of Papua. Food, munitions, the wounded, they were all carried in and out of that hellish country by locals. Called Fuzzy Wuzzy heroes in Australia because of their hair, the nation owes a great debt of gratitude to the people of Papua, as without them the campaign could not have been fought. As the full body of the South Seas Force was moving to Buna, Allied command began to react. By some miracle, the 39th Battalion had turned out to be a highly capable fighting force, but there was no reason to assume that the other battalion stationed at Port Moresby would fare as well against the Japanese. Even if the Australian generals considered a Japanese advance across the Owen Stanley Mountains to be a fool's errand, likely to end in disaster, if they were determined to try, then they had to be opposed. On the 8th of August, Brigadier General Potts flew into Port Moresby. Potts was a very experienced officer in both World Wars. He had served in Gallipoli and France in the Great War, Syria, Greece and North Africa in the Second. As a major serving in the 2nd 16th Battalion, Potts was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his actions at the Battle of Litani River, and had risen fast to the rank of Brigadier. Behind him, on a small convoy, was the main body of the 21st Brigade, a third of the veteran 7th Division, an AIF formation. The 7th had been in combat since 1940, in North Africa, Greece and Syria, and was one of the best fighting formations in the Australian Army. By the 15th of August, two of the brigade's combat battalions, the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th, in addition to the Brigade H2, were beginning the arduous journey over the mountains. The 3rd Battalion, the 2nd 27th, was retained to defend Port Moresby. The Green 53rd Battalion had preceded them, and the whole force was heading for a mountain pass on the north slopes called Isurava, where the 39th Battalion was waiting for them. Isurava can be considered the first real mountain pass on the Kokdoa Track. From here, as you move southwest, the terrain becomes steeper, colder and more formidable. Potts found the 39th dug in around the small village itself, with its companies arranged for 360-degree defence. About 2 kilometres further back, the 53rd Battalion was holding Aola, where the track itself split. Before the battle began, both sides were facing crippling supply issues. Even though the Japanese were fighting on their side of the mountains, the men were already running low on rations. A specialist supply battalion had left Rabaul on the 25th of August, but as the Battle of Milne Bay was going badly for the Japanese, air cover could not be provided and the convoy was forced to turn around. Given the defeat at Milne Bay, some Japanese staff officers advocated the abandonment of the drive to Port Moresby before the majority of the South Seas Force had entered the mountains. These concerns were based purely on logistical considerations, but they were overruled. The Australians were faring little better. Their lines of communication stretched over 100 kilometres of single-file mountainous trail. Unlike the Japanese, they could resupply by air, but this was extremely problematic in the cloudy, mountainous terrain. Potts was already considering withdrawing from Isurava just to improve his supply situation when the Japanese attacked. At the head of the 144th Infantry Regiment, General Horii advanced towards Isurava. His plan for the battle was to envelop the forward Australian formation, identified as the 39th Battalion, and destroy it. The 144th would advance in a regimental attack. 2 battalions, the 1st and 3rd, would assault the primary Australian defences at Isurava. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion would execute a left hook through the jungle and flank the defences along a secondary path called the Eora Track. The attack began at dawn of the 26th of August. 2 battalions began advancing up the track towards Isurava when they encountered the main concentration of the 29th. The Australians were in a formidable defensive position, dug in on the steep slope of the mountain and covered by thick jungle. The 5 companies, they had been reinforced by 1 from the 2nd 14th Battalion, were arranged in a circle. After engaging a forward Australian patrol, the Japanese stumbled into the defences. The Australians held their fire until the advancing infantry was within grenade throwing range, but the Japanese could not see the defenders' fighting positions through the thick jungle. The initial encounter was costly for the Japanese. Withering Bren gunfire tore into their front ranks and the attack immediately stalled. As was Japanese doctrine, they immediately began moving around the flanks of the Australian position, advancing towards the high ground on the Australian left. Despite this manoeuvre, as the jungle cover was so thick they could still not see the Australians. For hours the 1st and 3rd Battalions threw themselves against the defences to no avail. The performance of the 39th Battalion at Isurava was exemplary. Outnumbered more than 2 to 1, the militiamen fought tenaciously. The commander of the 144th Regiment, Colonel Kusonose, noted the exceptionally high fighting spirit of the Australians when ordering the reserve 3rd Battalion into the attack. The Japanese were surprised by the Australian stubbornness, as the defenders would resort to engaging in hand-to-hand combat rather than retreating. Because of the thick vegetation, the combat was viciously intimate. Point-blank grenade duels were common. Dawn on the next day found the Australians holding the same ground, with dead Japanese piling up in front of their fighting positions. But the ferocity of the Japanese assault was only increasing. The 39th Battalion's historian records one of these attacks. Across the creek they swept in swift thrust that sliced through E Company's thin front line, cutting off Dalby's left platoon and a section of the right platoon, and, swarming behind them, forced them forward and out of their posts. Through the widening breach poured another flood of the attackers to swirl round behind the remainder of the right platoon from the rear. They were met with Bren gun and Tommy gun, with bayonet and grenade, but still they came, to close with a buffet of fist and boot and rifle butt, the steel of crashing helmets and of straining, strangling fingers. In this vicious fighting, man to man and hand to hand, Merritt's men were in imminent peril of annihilation, but 2 quick counterattacks turned that furious tide. While the 39th was stopping the Japanese advance cold, their rear was under severe threat by the flanking attack of the Japanese 2nd Battalion. The Japanese had crossed the river and were now approaching the village of Aola from the Australian right wing, an area which was primarily held by the 53rd Battalion. Although several AIF companies had reinforced this sector, Potts was deeply concerned about the mounting threat to Aola. He had no confidence in the 53rd Battalion's combat capability, which he communicated to his divisional commander. This unit should never have been placed in this situation. If the Japanese broke through in this sector, the 39th would be cut off and destroyed. The veteran 2nd 16th Battalion was moving up in support, but as the Japanese continued to probe forward, the situation was growing more dire by the hour. Somehow, 3 days into the battle, the Australians were still holding the position together. The tight defensive perimeter of the 39th Battalion had been reinforced by 3 companies of the 2nd 14th, and the bulk of the 2nd 16th Battalion had deployed to the front of the 53rd's position. By the 30th of August, Horii was displeased with the situation. Clearly, the 144th Regiment alone was not able to dislodge the Australians from this formidable defensive position. He decided to commit the main body of the fresh 41st Infantry Regiment to battle. In a good piece of generalship, Horii ordered the 41st to reinforce the attack on Aola and bypass the main strength of the 39th Battalion, which was taking an increasingly severe toll on the Japanese. At that very time, Potts was doing everything he could to hold together a deteriorating situation. He repeatedly requested that the remainder of his brigade, the 2nd 27th Battalion, be moved forward to relieve both the 39th and the 53rd. But with Japanese now in commanding positions around Aola, the whole force was in danger of being enveloped. That day, Potts ordered the 39th and 2nd 14th Battalions to begin withdrawing from Isurava towards his HQ at Aola. The Japanese pursued in their typically dogged and aggressive style, constantly keeping contact with the Australian companies as they withdrew. At the same time, the forces deployed down the Iorwibaiwa track, forward of the 53rd Battalion's position, began to move back to the village. The performance of the 39th Battalion at the Battle of Isurava was truly exceptional. For the better part of a week, the Victorian militiamen, with the aid of the 2nd 14th Battalion, had stopped the Japanese cold. But how could this barely trained battalion from temperate Victoria perform so well in some of the most vicious jungle fighting the army had seen? Indeed, they were every bit as formidable and committed as the veteran AIF companies who fought alongside them. This is especially perplexing considering how poorly the 53rd Battalion had performed, considering it had a comparable amount of training. The answer comes down to the fundamental elements of unit cohesion, the process by which a group of men are forged into a cohesive whole. The fighting spirit of the 39th is certainly explained, at least partially, by the quality of the battalion's officers. Although many were older men, the vast majority were Great War veterans. This well of experience infused the young riflemen who made up the battalion's rank and file, increasing their confidence, cohesion, and esprit de corps. That experience was only improved by the injection of 16 officers from the AIF prior to the deployment of the 39th to Kokoda. This group of mostly young men had forged a bond which would drive them to heroic feats at Isurava. They performed far better than anyone could have hoped. In fact, the lead companies of the 144th Regiment who had engaged the 39th Battalion during the week-long battle were now at 50% strength. Such was the toll the battle had taken on the Japanese. As Potts began withdrawing from Isurava, the Australian forces entered one of the most harrowing episodes of the whole campaign, the 2-week fighting withdrawal to Ioribaiwa on the south slopes of the Owen Stanley Mountains. Withdrawing in close contact with the enemy is one of the most difficult operations in warfare. There is always the danger that an orderly fighting withdrawal will devolve into a rout. This danger is even more acute when your enemy is as skillful and committed as the Japanese. The battalions began withdrawing one by one, the 39th moving back to a river crossing at Eora. As the two AIF battalions began a staggered withdrawal, intense combat raged. The clear front lines had dissolved and small groups of Australian and Japanese soldiers did battle all along the track. As the Japanese were more comfortable cutting through the jungle, they intercepted the Australian column at different places. Numerous tales of heroism and horror are hidden in these vicious little battles, where groups of men would simply be lost forever without a trace. By the 31st, the 2nd 14th Battalion had suffered dearly, with over 140 men missing. The 2nd 16th covered the depleted 2nd 14th from the high ground alongside the track, but they were hard pressed by their enemy. A sharp, day-long battle was fought at the Eora River as the 2nd 16th Battalion held the oncoming Japanese. Over 2 days, the 41st Regiment, which was leading the pursuit of the Australians, suffered over 100 casualties, but the fresh men of the Koiwai Battalion continued to probe forward. The other Australian battalions moved in column towards the rear. Upon reaching Maiola, about halfway along the track, the 53rd Battalion were ordered to drop their weapons and march on to Port Moresby. As the 21st Brigade continued its withdrawal towards Afogi, it was joined by the 2nd 27th Battalion, allowing the 39th to finally be relieved. Potts' brigade was now complete, but the 2nd 16th and 2nd 14th Battalions were at roughly half strength, including sick and wounded. A nasty day-long battle was fought at Templeton's crossing, where the second track met the main line. This time it was up to the 2nd 14th to hold the Japanese. They attacked at 8 AM, hitting the forward companies hard. In another vicious close quarters fight, conducted with bayonet and submachine gun, the Australians stopped the main attack. Nonetheless, as was Japanese doctrine, they immediately began moving around the flanks through the jungle. By 10 o'clock, the 2nd 16th Battalion, farther towards the rear, was heavily engaged, and the forward elements, now threatened with encirclement, were forced to withdraw. Japanese jungle warfare doctrine emphasized flanking attacks, and it had proven to be extremely effective along the Kokdoa Track. Although when holding good defensive positions, the Australians had shown that they were more than a match for the Japanese in close quarters battle, as soon as the combat grew mobile, the Japanese immediately flanked through the jungle. As the 39th and 2nd 14th reached Maiola on the 3rd of September, Potts began to evaluate his situation. His brigade was exhausted by a week of fighting. They had lost the 53rd Battalion, and the men were now entering the cold upper altitudes for which they were unprepared. Given the superior strength of the Japanese forces, there was no way his exhausted men could hold them. On the 2nd of September, he told his divisional commander, Major General Allen, that he now planned to draw the Japanese further and further into the mountains with the explicit aim of stretching their supply lines. Considering how bad the Australian supply situation was, without aerial resupply it had to be worse for the Japanese. So the withdrawal continued. On the 6th of September, the brigade was engaged again east of Ofogi. The 2nd 27th was able to halt the primary assault down the track, but as was Japanese doctrine, they immediately began probing around the flanks. A few hours later, the lead Japanese elements were within sight of the brigade headquarters. The staff and HQ company found themselves in a very hot engagement, with machine gun and mortar fire landing amongst them. Potts himself joined the defence, and the Japanese were only held off with great difficulty. As the situation had grown desperate, the brigade's 3 battalions counterattacked towards the brigade HQ, relieving it by nightfall. The 2nd 27th Battalion was cut off around Ofogi, and many thought it had been destroyed. It eventually arrived back at Australian-held positions almost a month later after a tortuous march through the jungle without supply or communication. Badly bruised and beaten, hungry, tired and footsore, by the 12th of September Potts had extricated most of his brigade from the worst and highest parts of the mountains. He had reached a feature known as Ioribaiwa, a ridge in the Imita Range, beyond which lay the foothills of the Owen Stanley Mountains. Potts was met by Brigadier General Porter and ordered to return to Port Moresby and report to Divisional Command. As the Australians were now firmly on their side of the mountains, their logistical considerations had eased substantially. The 39th and 53rd had been replaced by the 3rd Battalion, a CMF unit which had seen some action around Ofogi, but the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th Battalions were exhausted. They had been in nearly constant battle, and as these were the 2 senior units, it had been up to them to slow the Japanese advance so the other battalions could withdraw. They were about half strength, including sick and lightly wounded. Word came that substantial reinforcements were about to arrive. The veteran 25th Brigade of the 7th Division, under the command of the young and energetic Brigadier General Ether. Although the Australian position was now improving by the day, Major General Allen began to feel significant pressure from Brisbane. MacArthur was growing more and more anxious about the situation. On the 30th of August, the night the Japanese attack on Milne Bay had been disastrously defeated by the Australians, MacArthur cabled the Joint Chiefs of Staff in a tone that can only be described as panic. Unless the strategic situation is constantly reviewed in the light of current enemy potentialities in the Pacific, and unless moves are made to meet the changing conditions, a disastrous outcome is bound to result shortly. It is no longer a question here of preparing a projected offensive, without additional naval forces, either British or American, and unless steps are taken to match the heavy air and ground forces the enemy is assembling, I predict the development shortly of a situation similar to those that have successfully overwhelmed our forces in the Pacific since the beginning of the war. This level of alarm was totally unwarranted. Lieutenant General Rao, the commander of all forces in New Guinea, and the man who had replaced Major General Murray, recalled later that, "At no time did I ever consider the capture of Port Moresby by the enemy from the north as possible," sentiments shared by Major General Allen. On the 6th of September, with the Japanese forces in Milne Bay decisively defeated, MacArthur told General George Marshall, "The Australians have proven themselves to be unable to match the enemy in jungle fighting. More aggressive leadership is needed." The same sentiments were communicated to General Allen in Port Moresby. But what MacArthur clearly did not understand, sitting in his plush office at GHQ, is more aggressive leadership was not going to change the facts on the ground along the Kokoda Track. At this time, Major General George Vassie, the Australian Chief of Staff for Home Forces, wrote in a personal letter to General Rao, "General Headquarters is like a bloody barometer in a cyclone, up and down every 2 minutes. They're like the militia, they need to be blooded." Vassie was right. MacArthur was simply showing his inexperience. The simple fact was, with all of the prestige which came with the appointment of General MacArthur to Southwest Pacific Area Command, he was actually far less experienced than virtually all of the Australian generals he commanded. MacArthur's early career had been very successful. A man of great personal courage, MacArthur had received numerous awards for bravery. For his actions as a junior officer at the Battle of Veracruz, where he had led a small body of men in a daring raid, MacArthur was nominated for the Medal of Honor, the American equivalent to the Victoria Cross. Despite the personal courage MacArthur displayed, his only real battle experience as a large unit commander came from a 6-month stint as a brigade CO in the 42nd Rainbow Division during 1918. However, the 84th Infantry Brigade never operated independently. Additionally, the brigade was only in combat for about half of the time MacArthur was in command, roughly 3 months. MacArthur's meteoric rise meant he skipped the long years most general officers had spent commanding companies and battalions. This led to disengagement with the more mundane, practical aspects of warfare, such as ensuring that your men were well-fed and well-trained. More aggressive leadership was not going to mean the men on the Kokoda track had something to eat at night and enough rifle rounds to fight the enemy. Yet, all throughout 1942, when a battle was not going to plan, MacArthur would blame the local leadership, both Australian and American, without ever taking the time to really understand the nature of the battle being fought. The reality was, 1942 was his first real test as an operational commander, and it showed. MacArthur was an excellent military theorist and strategist. He was able to compose operational plans that were brilliant, but once battle was joined and the time for planning was over, he clearly lacked both patience and a cool temperament. In the real world, battle has a flow, a give and take, which is the result of the fact that your enemy also has their own plans. Sometimes, even when it appears that your enemy is doing well, the tide of battle may be decisively shifting in your favour. Erwin Rommel famously described understanding this flow as feeling a battle through the tips of your fingers, and this skill really only comes with experience. Virtually all of the Australian generals MacArthur continually disparaged had spent the best part of 4 years in the Great War leading companies and battalions, rather than the 3 months MacArthur had, and then 2 years commanding divisions and corps in North Africa. For example, Major General Allen, the commander of the Australian 7th Division, had commanded a platoon in 1915. He was promoted to captain in March 1916, where he led a company of the 45th Battalion. In 1918, Allen eventually achieved the rank of lieutenant colonel and led the 45th Battalion itself till the end of the war. While serving in the 45th Battalion, Allen led his company at Pozières, the Somme, Messines, and then led the battalion as a whole at Monument Wood. In the current conflict, he commanded the 16th Brigade in 1940, which fought at Bardia, Tobruk, Greece and Syria, and was then promoted to the command of 7th Division. That is the level of disparity in command experience we are talking about. The fact that the Australian generals were not panicking simply reflected both their greater level of familiarity with situations such as this, and the fact that they had a better understanding of the battle itself. Allen and Rowell knew that the tide was beginning to turn in their favour. As the Australians were digging in at Ioribaiwa, events elsewhere in the theatre were having a serious impact on the South Seas force. The American offensive at Guadalcanal was a strategic masterstroke. The 17th Army Command had been almost entirely focused on the capture of Port Moresby in July, but as the combat on Guadalcanal intensified, they were forced to react to the Allied advance. Like a great magnet, the naval battle around Guadalcanal sucked in Japanese air and naval assets, and by September, General Hyakutake was becoming increasingly anxious about the Japanese position at Buna. The Navy simply no longer had the aircraft or ships to defend the base, and the possibility of a naval or airborne landing in Horii's rear was a continual concern for 17th Army Command. Horii was ordered to deploy 1 battalion back to Buna as a garrison and withdraw the remainder of the 41st Regiment out of the mountains to Kokoda. The reality was, Horii could not support 2 regiments on the south slopes in any case. The Japanese still had a formidable force facing the Australians. The whole 144th Regiment, which was heavily reinforced with mountain gun and engineer regiments. There were probably between 3,000 and 5,000 Japanese facing the Australians at Ioribaiwa, outnumbering them by a margin of about 2 to 1, although all of these forces may not have been committed to battle. The morning of the 14th found the ridge at Ioribaiwa held by the exhausted 21st Brigade, which was now less than 2 battalions strong. The 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th had been merged into one composite battalion, which was not at full strength. These 2 formations had held off the Japanese throughout the withdrawal, and as the South Seas Force had substantially more battalions available, Horii was able to rotate his frontline units. This had allowed the Japanese to share the burden between all of their formations. This composite battalion held the centre of the line, with the 3rd holding the right flank, and the fresh 25th Brigade moving up behind them. The newly arrived 2nd 31st Battalion had taken up a position on the far left flank, and the other battalions were still moving up behind the ridge when the Japanese attacked. In what can only be described as a very skillful operation, the 144th Regiment began a series of meticulous and careful attacks, probing the Australian position for weaknesses. The Japanese had carried a mountain gun all the way over the Owen Stanley Mountains, and the lull in the fighting had allowed them to finally bring it into action. The composite battalion in the centre were the most exposed, and the Japanese artillery soon began to take its toll. The 2nd 14th Battalion historian recorded the day's fighting. The strain was beginning to tell on all members of the unit, and some of the lads in the forward positions who had stood up to it well and had done a wonderful job right through began to crack up. Enemy mortar, MG and field piece continued to do deadly work on our forward positions all morning, and our casualties mounted. Just as they had all throughout the campaign, the Japanese infantry began feeling around the flanks. During the night of the 14th, platoons of Japanese had crept close to the Australian positions and entrenched their machine guns. The exhausted battalions were not patrolling in the aggressive style that was typical of Australian doctrine, allowing the Japanese to approach close to their positions. On the 15th, Ether decided to try and flank the Japanese and ordered the fresh 2nd 31st Battalion to move to the left, but they were met by a large Japanese force that was advancing in this area, leading to a day-long firefight. On the Australian right wing, a probing Japanese patrol had exploited a gap between the 3rd and 2nd 33rd Battalions and had reached the summit of the ridge. Commanding the high ground, the Japanese infantry dug in and withstood 2 Australian counterattacks. As the battle raged throughout the day, the Australian positions were suffering badly to well-placed Japanese machine gun, artillery and mortars, as the Japanese infantry battalions had been reinforced with large numbers of these supporting arms. More concerning was the increasing Japanese activity around the Australian flanks. Ether was in a tough position. Although now at the head of a fresh brigade that had been reinforced with a pioneer battalion, the Japanese had attacked before he could effectively deploy his forces. At this point, the exhausted 21st Brigade was barely capable of putting up resistance, and his own battalions had been deployed in a haphazard manner. About 5 kilometres to the rear across a forested valley was another good defensive position, the Imita Ridge. A withdrawal to this terrain feature made perfectly good tactical sense. It would allow him to properly place his battalions in good defensive order and relieve the 21st Brigade. The only problem with this decision was Imita is the last ridgeline of the Owen Stanley Mountains. Beyond this lay the open river valleys of the coast. There were obviously other good defensive positions between here and Moresby, but the psychological impact of being pushed from the mountains was substantial. Ether reported the situation to 7th Division headquarters and asked for permission to withdraw to Imita. General Allen impressed on Ether the importance of holding Ioribaiwa, but left the decision up to him. On the 16th, Ether decided that holding was not advisable, considering the position had already been penetrated. His orders were to begin offensive operations, but that was impossible given the current disordered state of his brigade. At 11 AM, the 2nd 14th and the 2nd 16th Battalions began to withdraw, covered by the 2nd 25th. In a well-executed and orderly movement, the battalions began leapfrogging through one another, and by 4 PM the last Australians had left Ioribaiwa. By midnight, Ether was in a solid defensive position along the Imita Ridge with all of his exhausted units in the rear. Including the 3rd Pioneers, 5 fresh and full-strength battalions were dug in along the ridgeline, which immediately began dispatching patrols into the valley. Aggressive patrol activity was a key to Australian infantry doctrine, and this immediately produced results. Several Japanese parties were ambushed in the darkness, inflicting significant casualties. The Australians noted a considerable change in Japanese aggression, as for the first time in a month, Australian patrols began to dominate no man's land. Indeed, for the first time since Isurava, the Australians were in a good position. Although Brigadier General Ether had brought the situation under control, concern was growing in Canberra. On the 9th of September, the War Cabinet asked General Blamey, the Southwest Pacific Area Land Commander and highest-ranking Australian general, to go to Port Moresby and survey the situation. After flying to Port Moresby and conferring with General Rowell and General Allen, Blamey was back in Australia on the 14th. In a report to the War Council on the 16th, Blamey stated that he had full confidence in the outcome of the campaign, that Port Moresby was strongly held and the Japanese success thus far had been due to their superior numbers in the forward area, which had primarily been an outcome of Allied logistical problems. 2 additional brigades were en route, and he had full confidence in local leadership. That day, the Australian Prime Minister, John Curtin, received a phone call from General MacArthur. MacArthur, contradicting Blamey, told Curtin that the primary reason for the current situation was simply the poor performance of the Australian fighting men. He was convinced that the Japanese forces on the Kokdoa Track were smaller than the Australians who opposed them, and Australian leadership had been poor. The supply problems, in MacArthur's opinion, were being overstated, as clearly the Japanese had supply issues as well. However, they were attacking, not retreating. Finally, MacArthur concluded by stating that it does not matter how many more Australians were sent to Port Moresby if they would not fight. MacArthur's proposed solution was that General Blamey should go to Port Moresby himself and take command of the situation there. Curtin and MacArthur had a good relationship. Curtin, like many politicians, was untrusting of his own generals, who would often dominate military discussions. In MacArthur, Curtin found a political ally, a method by which he could effectively circumvent his own military leadership. In Curtin, MacArthur also found both a willing ally and a method of actually exercising direct control over Australian forces. Although clearly Blamey did not want to undermine confidence in Raoul, and as Supreme Land Force Commander, he had a force of over 500,000 men to administer and control. With pressure being applied from both MacArthur and Curtin, he had little choice. Blamey departed for Port Moresby. On the 23rd of September, he arrived only to find Raoul furious. The two men immediately fell out, and after a week of arguing, Raoul was relieved of command. One ill-advised phone call to the Prime Minister had precipitated a command crisis in New Guinea. Despite the furor in Australia, the reality on the ground was the campaign had decisively turned in favour of the Allies. The Japanese were now in a position to see the searchlights at Port Moresby. Indeed, the Japanese official history treats the taking of the Ioribaiwa ridge as a crowning moment of glory. They had driven the Australians from the mountains. True, Horii had only been ordered to take a foothold on the south slopes of the Owen Stanley Mountains, but he had already exceeded his orders. Nevertheless, the Japanese account of the battle omits the fact that Horii's men were starving. The diary of a Japanese officer reads, 17 September, selected camping ground. We are to wait here until the middle of next month before further operations. Not a grain of rice left. Each unit gathered about 2 days of supply of food which had been scattered about. Dreamed all night of lost subordinates. 18th of September, transportation of rations reported to be difficult. How will we live in our present condition without any food? In another few days we will have to eat tree roots or tree bark. Heard distant rifle shots. Slept and dreamt of home. 19th of September, inspected tents and noticed the scarcity of food. Entire company turned out to forage for food. 13 malaria, 6 diarrhea, and 5 other patients are getting worse. No medicines have arrived. Went to battalion headquarters to report the food situation and requisition supplies. Returned empty-handed. Wonder what General Headquarters is doing. Patients will die and we will soon starve. How can we fight against this? Just as General Morris had predicted, and just as Brigadier General Potts had intended, the further the Australians had drawn the superior Japanese forces into the mountains, the worse and worse their supply situation had become. They were now quite literally starving. The reality was, without airborne resupply, a formation the size of the South Seas Force could not operate on the south side of the Owen Stanley Mountains. The lines of communication to Buna were just too poor. The attack at Ioribaiwa had been one last maximum effort from Horii's men, but now their condition was deteriorating by the day. They too had been fighting almost continually for a month, and their casualties had been severe, well over 1,000. The tactical situation was now reversed, as the starving and exhausted Japanese faced fresh and comparatively well-fed Australian units, who continually harassed them with patrols and ambushes. For the first time in the campaign, Australian artillery was engaged. In a Herculean effort, the men of the 14th Field Regiment had hauled a pair of 25-pounders up a jungle-covered mountain at Owa's Corner, which now began to bombard the Japanese positions on the Ioribaiwa ridge. The Australian plan had worked. After a couple of days at the Imita Ridge, Ether was ready for a counterattack. His orders had been to begin offensive operations, although that was impossible given the situation at Ioribaiwa. As intended, the withdrawal to the Imita Ridge had stabilised the situation, and with his battle-depleted units relieved, the brigade staff began planning. The Australian force was not large, 132 officers and 2,492 men, but the Japanese were badly weakened. Although the full strength of the 144th Regiment was in the forward area, most of the 41st Regiment was strung out along the track to Kokoda. By the 23rd of September, a week after the retreat to Imita Ridge, the Australians were advancing. The 2nd 25th Battalion began slowly probing along the track into the valley. They met no resistance. These were the first tentative steps in the Australian counteroffensive, one that would take the Allies all the way to Buna. That evening, the Australian lead elements had retaken Ioribaiwa Ridge after a sharp battle, and the Japanese were now in full retreat back across the mountains. The South Seas force was quite literally out of provisions of all kinds. The starving, battle-weary men were ordered to withdraw back to Kokoda. Just as General Horii had predicted before the operation had begun, the whole advance over the Owen Stanley Mountains was ending in disaster. One of the premier jungle warfighting units in the Japanese army was simply wasting away. Major General recounted the scene. Our bodies were completely fatigued, so climbing even the smallest hill required a great effort. The majority of the members of the unit were carrying wounded on stretchers. My battalion's 7th Company was meant to be protecting the rear, but they were carrying casualties from the field hospital, as were members of the force's wireless radio unit. Because there was no life-sustaining rice, every step seemed to exhaust one's entire strength. Progress was exceedingly slow, as we climbed the mountain counting each step, gasping for each breath. Despite some encouragement to struggle through the pain, many were stooped over, their eyes filled with tears and without even the strength to urge themselves on. My heart was filled with sorrow. The Australians pursued carefully. On the 1st of October, the 3rd Battalion began to advance, followed closely by the rest of the brigade, setting out from Ioribaiwa towards the hill passes around Minari. Their progress was good, and in 5 days they had retaken half of the Kokdoa Track and had patrols moving through the jungle towards Templeton's crossing. Efogi, Minari, Miola, places that had witnessed such desperate fighting as Potts's brigade had tried to withdraw, were taken without resistance. Evidence of the hardships of the Japanese was everywhere. Dead Japanese men who clearly died from starvation or sickness, widespread signs of dysentery, even evidence that they were eating wood. As the Australians advanced through Efogi, they found the battlefields that had seen such savage combat just 1 month before. Hundreds of Australian and Japanese dead littered the hillsides. This included some Australian prisoners who had been beheaded. The lead units caught up with the Japanese rearguard at Templeton's crossing, less than 10 kilometres from Isurava. By this point the advance began to slow. Even with a force of just over 2,000 men, Ether was struggling to sustain them. Although increasing air support was available for resupply, this was a very difficult and dangerous task for the aircrew, and initially results were poor. Organisational integration between the US Army Air Corps transports, Australian logistics personnel and the ground force was difficult, but after the intervention of Lieutenant General Horii, Rao's successor, the situation improved. It was dangerous and monotonous work for the American pilots, flying through the cloudy mountains looking for small clearings in the jungle. By the 11th, the supply situation was improving, and Eartha felt confident in advancing further. Just in front of Templeton's crossing, the Japanese rearguard had dug in. The Australian advance met its first real resistance. The main defensive position lay in the crest of a valley with steep hillsides on either side. From the 12th to the 14th of October, the 2nd 33rd Battalion began probing forward in a painfully slow advance. The Japanese had dug one-man fighting pits that were very hard to see and engage. After a day of constant fighting, a company had been able to flank the main Japanese line by climbing a ridge, but making any further progress still required clawing the Japanese out of their fighting positions one at a time. The 2nd 25th Battalion was moving down a tributary track that approached Templeton's crossing from the left flank. Resistance here was determined, but the terrain was less formidable, and the Australians made steady gains with reasonably light casualties. After flanking a Japanese heavy machine gun position and killing the gunner with a grenade, a corporal named Cook found some suspicious-looking meat. After taking it back to the battalion medic, it was deemed to be human, evidence of just how critical the Japanese supply situation had become. Even with the Japanese so hungry as to resort to cannibalism, in the face of thick bush and continued resistance, progress began to slow and casualties began to mount. By the 15th of October, the 3rd Battalion had moved up in support and continued a well-executed, wide flanking movement through the jungle, but when the Australians reached the Japanese fighting positions, they found them empty. With the fall of Templeton's crossing, the Australians were now on the north slope of the mountains, a day's march from Isurava where the campaign had started. The main force of the 25th Brigade advanced with 3 battalions in close formation. The 3rd moved along the track while the 2nd 25th and 2nd 33rd advanced through the rainforest on either flank. About 500 metres down the track they ran into another line of Japanese resistance, again fighting from well-concealed foxholes. After the 3rd Battalion dug in for the night, the next morning the 2nd 25th began moving around the left flank. A company commander, Captain Atkinson, recalled the attack. They had first to dispose of a machine gun, and Tongs did it. He crawled up a fire lane under fire and tossed a grenade which lobbed right in the pit. The two Japs in the pit were blown clean out and sprawled one on each other, dead. That started the ball rolling. The men got excited and began yelling and whooping. As the right flank had now been penetrated, the whole position began to collapse and the Japanese retreated towards Eora Creek. The 16th Brigade now moved up to replace Ether's 21st, which had over 700 casualties to sickness alone at this point. Such was the difficulty of fighting in these godforsaken mountains. The 16th Brigade was a veteran formation which had seen extensive action in Greece, Syria and North Africa, but this would be its first encounter with the Japanese. The brigade was led by Brigadier General Lloyd. Like many AIF officers, Lloyd had a long and extensive First World War career and had performed well at the Siege of Tobruk. As he led his divisions towards the fighting at Eora Creek, the 2nd 1st, 2nd 2nd and 2nd 3rd, the difficulty that awaited his men became apparent. The main Japanese defensive line was now anchored on the Eora Creek village. In this area, the track follows the deep ravine of the Eora Creek with thickly wooded steep slopes. At the village, the track crossed from one side of the valley to the other. The Japanese defence rested primarily along the track itself, just forward of the village. The task of clearing this defensive line was given to the 2nd 2nd Battalion, commanded by Major Edgar. Edgar's plans were to attack with 4 companies, in a great right hook. He would move around the back of the 3rd Battalion, which was currently engaging the enemy. 2 companies would climb to the top of the mountains to the right, some 500 metres above the valley floor at an altitude of over 2,000 metres, and continue along the ridgeline. Once these units had advanced towards the crossing, they would cut back to the track behind the defences. The other 2 companies would move through the rainforest closer to the valley floor, but still to the right of the 3rd Battalion. By 11 AM on the 20th, the 2 lead companies had reached their assembly positions on the ridge and began the attack. The Australians advanced in single file in quiet mountain fog. Eventually, the far right company made contact with the main Japanese defensive position, a number of machine guns and fighting positions arranged in depth. Throughout the day, the Australians methodically engaged these machine gun positions, taking them one at a time. The weapon of choice for this kind of fighting was the hand grenade. Men would crawl up to within 5 metres and throw their bombs. It was hard and dangerous fighting, and throughout the day casualties mounted. The 2nd Company on the left met with far less resistance as it had flanked the Japanese forward positions, but as it moved up in support it was forced to engage the entrenched machine guns. After hours of this vicious, close-range fighting, the Japanese broke and ran to the rear, leaving machine guns and rifles. But as the 2 companies pursued them towards the crossing, they ran into yet another defensive line, preventing further gains, and as night fell, they bivouacked in a box formation. The other 2 companies that moved along the valley floor had a very similar day's fighting. Clearly the Japanese had deployed their defences in considerable depth. The next morning, the fresh 2nd 1st Battalion moved through the Australian positions and attacked in another multi-company right-flanking move through the forest, but they found the Japanese positions empty. They had retreated under the cover of darkness. The Australians now had to contend with the Eora Creek crossing itself, perhaps the most formidable piece of terrain along the whole track. As the Australians pushed on, by the 22nd of October they found themselves on a bare ridge looking down on the village of Eora itself. The 2nd 1st Battalion kept attacking with the same energy it had in the days before. However, the defences were formidable. The attackers would have to cross 2 bridges which were dominated by Japanese machine gun positions. There really was no easy way to flank them as the river was treacherous. The battalion CO decided on a silent night attack. None of the company commanders were impressed with the idea, but in reality there really wasn't an easy alternative. At 4 AM the men moved out. Miraculously, 2 companies were able to cross in the darkness before the Japanese were alerted. Even as machine gun fire erupted around them, the 3rd Company made it across the river with only 2 casualties. In the darkness, the different companies and platoons lost contact with each other. The Japanese 3rd Battalion of the 144th Regiment had skillfully entrenched on the surrounding high ground, which dominated the bridges and valley. One platoon was pinned between the river and the cliff, and only saved when a corporal climbed the escarpment and killed a pair of Japanese soldiers who were sniping from above. As day broke, fire from the dominating Japanese positions slowed the Australian progress to a standstill, and by nightfall the positions had not changed appreciably. For 2 days the lead elements of the 2nd 1st Battalion remained pinned just under the Japanese positions, but the reserve 2nd 2nd Battalion could do precious little to help. Brigadier Lloyd approved a plan to try and flank the whole Japanese position with a force of 2 companies from the 2nd 3rd Battalion, but this also proved to be a painfully slow advance in the face of entrenched Japanese positions on the ridges. For a week, the Australian Brigade tried in vain to dislodge the Japanese from their formidable defences, all to the growing consternation of General Headquarters, but in reality the terrain was treacherous. The whole of the 2nd 3rd Battalion had advanced up the high ground on the Australian left and was slowly encroaching on the Japanese right flank, but the steepness of the valley made this extremely difficult. The 2nd 1st Battalion was still in the bottom of the valley, taking the Japanese positions one at a time, but only at tremendous cost. The Japanese had built a formidable fortification on the ridge, with interlocking trenches connecting heavy machine gun positions. It took the 2nd 3rd days of fighting to finally take the position. On the 28th of October, with the Japanese right flank finally turned, they were forced to withdraw to Isurava. The Japanese had also suffered badly in the 2 weeks of fighting through Templeton's Crossing and Eora Creek. Although ordered to stop the Australians at these positions, Horii was concerned that the whole regiment would be destroyed by the flanking attack of the 2nd 3rd Battalion. Considering this was the exact situation faced by Potts at the beginning of the campaign, the roles truly had been reversed. Eora Creek had been the last stand of the 144th Regiment in the Owen Stanley Mountains. It had held up the 16th Brigade for a week. This delay cost Major General Allen his position. Under pressure from MacArthur, he was relieved of command of the 7th Division. This was a shame considering how much the forces under his command had achieved, but even before his replacement, Major General Vassie, had arrived to take command, the Japanese were in full-blown retreat. By the 30th of October, the 16th Brigade had taken Aola and were sleeping in the Isurava rest house, the scene of the heroic defence by the 39th Battalion. The brigade advanced down the 2 tracks, the main path to Kokoda and the secondary track used by Horii to flank the 53rd Battalion. They met little resistance, and by the 3rd of November, a platoon under Lieutenant Black had penetrated as far as the town of Kokoda itself, finding it empty. That day, the Australians quietly entered Kokoda unopposed. With the capture of the Kokoda airfield, they had a firm logistical base on the north slope of the Owen Stanley Mountains. Nevertheless, one final battle remained before the Australians broke out of the hills and into the coastal plain. Kokoda sits in a high valley and is essentially surrounded by mountains. The exit of the valley ran through the small village of Oivi to the east, and on the high ground here fresh elements of the 41st Regiment, which had been withdrawn to Kokoda several weeks before, had taken up strong blocking positions. The Japanese had assembled most of what remained of the South Seas force for the Battle of Oivi. In the centre, on the high ground facing Kokoda, there were 3 battalions of the crack 41st Regiment. These covered the main Kokoda-Buna road. The exhausted 144th, which had retreated all the way back from Ioribaiwa, was positioned to guard the left flank, a little to the rear of the 41st, covering a secondary trail from Isurava. Horii positioned his headquarters about 5 kilometres to the rear at the front at Gorari. With the Kokoda airfield in Allied hands, the supply situation had vastly improved. The new 7th Division commander, Vassie, was able to sustain 2 brigades in the Kokoda Valley. For the first time in the whole campaign, the Japanese were about to face the Australians on something approaching even terms. By November the 4th, Vassie had both the 16th and 25th Brigades deployed in the valley facing the Japanese. The 2nd 6th Field Company was at work repairing the airstrip, and the 7th Division headquarters entered the village that afternoon. In an official ceremony, to the delight of the assembled men, Vassie hoisted the Australian flag over the village of Kokoda. The first Dakota transport arrived at Kokoda at 9 AM the next day, and supplies accumulated rapidly. For the first time in weeks, the men were issued chocolate. This underlined the difference between the Allies and the Japanese. The Australians could support a whole division across the Owen Stanley Mountains, and they would not starve because of Allied air power. As the 16th Brigade began advancing down the main track towards Oivi, they came into contact with the forward deployed Japanese units. The Australians now employed a standard tactic when engaging Japanese rearguard formations. The lead company would pin while the second company in line would immediately flank. This new drill proved to be extremely effective, as many Japanese elements were forced to withdraw without inflicting significant casualties. On the 5th of November, the lead elements of the 2nd 2nd and 2nd 3rd Battalions made contact with the main concentrations of the 41st Regiment along the high ground near Oivi. The Japanese were well dug in, and the Australians made slow progress. However, with the Kokoda airfield operational, mortar ammunition was now plentiful, and the Australians were able to use these weapons liberally, inflicting significant Japanese casualties. For 2 days the Australians probed the defences, making slow but steady progress. On the right flank, the 2nd 1st Battalion had found a new track. Starting from the small village of Kokoda, it ran parallel to the main road to Buna, but was a few kilometres south, along the lower slopes of the mountains. On the 4th, Vassie ordered the Australians to begin probing along this new track, and the whole battalion advanced, meeting little opposition. In a 2-day reconnaissance in force, the 2nd 1st Battalion marched down this track, meeting nothing but friendly locals. Eventually they reached a hill overlooking the Komusi River, about 5 kilometres to the rear of the Japanese positions. As Vassie noted the progress of the 2nd 1st Battalion on the Australian right flank, and the stubbornness of the Japanese defences on the left, he decided to commit the whole 25th Brigade to a daring flank attack. By the 8th, they had reached their starting position about halfway down the track at a place named Liani's Corner. As Ether set up his brigade HQ, the Australians were in an excellent tactical situation. As the main body of the 16th Brigade was engaging the 41st Regiment in a close fight around Oivi at the main defensive line, 3 fresh battalions were now in a position to potentially envelop the whole Japanese position. The Japanese arrayed their forces in depth, with the 144th Regiment deployed to the rear of the 41st. However, the Australians were now in position to cut the Kokoda-Buna road behind them. On the 8th, the decisive attack began. Ether committed all 3 battalions. His main strength, the 2nd 33rd and 2nd 25th Battalions, would attack the main defensive line from the rear, trapping the 41st Regiment in a pincer with the 16th Brigade. His 3rd Battalion, the 2nd 31st, was ordered to advance on Gorari, a village about 5 kilometres behind Oivi, where there was a large Japanese concentration. Finally, the 2nd 1st Battalion, which had temporarily been transferred to his command, would continue probing east with the aim of penetrating deeply into the Japanese rear. The attack on the 8th of November fell like an avalanche on the Japanese position. The 25th Brigade engaged the majority of the exhausted 144th Regiment. The 3 fresh Australian battalions immediately made headway. On the Australian right, the 2nd 31st began extending its companies to the right, probing for the open flank. By midday they had found it. They penetrated a gap between the 1st Battalion of the 144th Infantry Regiment and a mountain gun battalion, reaching the main track. In fact, they had penetrated the headquarters area of the South Seas Force, and Major General Horii was in grave danger of being killed. As the other 2 battalions smashed into the Japanese left flank, the 144th Regiment began to disintegrate. Confusion reigned in the Japanese force. The commander of the 41st Regiment had lost contact with the 144th and had no idea where any of its elements were. All he knew was he now had strong enemy formations in his rear area. The Japanese position was now catastrophic. By the 9th, the whole 25th Brigade was concentrated at Gorari, holding strong defensive position along the 41st Regiment's only means of escape. As Japanese elements flung themselves on the Australian defences, bodies began to pile up in front of their Bren gun positions. Faced with encirclement, large elements of the 41st Regiment took to the forest, abandoning their equipment as they went. Small Japanese formations held their ground and fought to the death, but these were steadily reduced by the 16th Brigade. As the retreating 144th Regiment tried to cross the Komusi River, they were engaged by the 2nd 1st Battalion. Major General Horii, fearing that an Allied attack on Buna was imminent, decided to travel down the river by raft. Horii was a brave man, but this was a foolhardy decision. The river was swollen with rain, and the out-of-control raft capsized. In his hasty retreat, Major General Horii drowned. Outmaneuvered by Vassie in a brilliant piece of generalship, Horii, like so many of his men, paid for the Japanese defeat with his life. The South Seas Force, utterly defeated, straggled down the Komusi River towards Buna in companies and platoons. The Kokdoa Track Campaign was over. The Australians had won. The Kokdoa Track Campaign was a brilliant Australian victory. Although Japanese numbers are hard to gauge accurately given the available source material, it is safe to say that Australian units were outnumbered until the Battle of Oivi. Throughout the campaign, the forward Japanese combat units probably had a strength of around 6,000, although not all of these units would have been facing the Australians at the same time. Against them, never more than a single brigade was deployed, not until the final operations around Kokoda. Often outnumbered 2-1 and facing battle-hardened jungle warfare specialists, the Australian units had performed exceptionally well. One cannot speak highly enough of the 39th Battalion. No one could have dared to hope that those men would fight so well under such horrific circumstances. By November, the Australian Army had showed that it was not only the equal of the Japanese in jungle warfare, but it may have surpassed them. Australian combat casualties for the whole campaign were 103 officers and 1,577 men, with killed in action totaling 39 officers and 586 enlisted. Japanese casualties are much harder to determine. The Japanese official history estimates that total casualties sustained during the advance to Ioribaiwa was just over 1,000. But considering the hardest fighting and worst defeats occurred after that point, and the acute starvation of Horii's forces, total casualties must be in the range of 3,000 to 4,000. The Japanese had, undoubtedly, fought brilliantly. Their attacks at Isurava, Efogi, and Ioribaiwa were conducted with tactical skill and determination. Horii was an extremely able commander, and the men he led endured unimaginable hardship. The fighting quality of the Japanese soldier is often overlooked in Western accounts of the Pacific War, but the truth is the Japanese were a truly formidable enemy, capable of so much more than suicidal banzai attacks. The individual men were extremely tough, they lived off simple food, and they were unafraid of the jungle. In attack, they pressed with both unrelenting pressure and always felt for the flanks. In defense, they positioned their heavy weapons with skill and held their positions with determination. Nonetheless, in truth, the whole Owen Stanley offensive was a blunder. Japanese logistical organization was, to be blunt, amateurish. The idea that Horii's men could fight across that country with 12 days' rations was simply ludicrous. The Australians had been proven correct. It was simply not possible for the Japanese to sustain sufficient forces across the Owen Stanley Mountains to ever be a realistic threat to Port Moresby, especially with the Australians opposing them. The further they advanced, the worse their situation became, and by the time they had reached Imita Ridge, they were starving. To say that the whole operation was foolhardy is an understatement. Just as they had throughout 1942, the Japanese had gambled on a quick Allied collapse. When it had not come, they faced catastrophe. The Australian generals had performed well. Vassey's leadership at Oivi had been inspired, as Horii had simply been out-generalled, outmaneuvered, and destroyed. Through the campaign, General Rowell and General Allen had provided cool heads and steady hands, and it was through their planning that the 25th Brigade arrived at Ioribaiwa at the critical time. Brigadier Potts, facing a crippling supply situation and enemy superiority, fought a skillfully executed, dogged and determined defensive campaign, especially at Isurava. Although he courted disaster at Efogi, without that fighting retreat to Ioribaiwa, the 144th Regiment would not have been as badly depleted as it was. But, like many other fine Australian generals, he was sidelined after the battle. Major General Allen, Lieutenant General Rowell, Brigadier General Potts and Major General Clowes, the commander of the Battle of Milne Bay, were all sidelined after winning battles against the Japanese because in MacArthur's opinion they were not aggressive enough. What MacArthur never really took the time to understand was the simple fact that the Australian Army was not the United States Army. Australian doctrine, much more like the British, did not emphasise simple aggression in the same way as the Americans. The Australian way of war was more cautious, more deliberate, less reckless. Maintaining balance through reserves was always emphasised, and withdrawals were not automatically viewed in the negative terms in which many American generals perceived them. As much as the retreat across the mountains had drawn withering criticism from MacArthur, that very withdrawal was the single manoeuvre that had defeated the Japanese on the Kokoda Track. Had the Australians simply stood at Isurava and fought to the death, they would have been destroyed and Horii's advance would have been virtually unopposed. But by drawing him into the mountains, the Australians starved his forces to death. This is the very reason why the Australian generals were never that concerned, and it showed the limited sophistication of MacArthur's understanding of the campaign, indeed of MacArthur's understanding of warfare in general. The reality was MacArthur was a poor choice for Supreme Allied Commander Southwest Pacific Area. What most Americans do not know to this day is that, if you remove the Philippines, this theatre was primarily an Australian theatre, all throughout the war. Even including the Philippine Offensive, MacArthur's forces were primarily Australian all the way until 1944. That made this theatre different to any other in the Pacific. Command here was a coalition, just like Europe. Tight integration between two allies was required to fight the war effectively. At lower levels of command, this was certainly achieved, especially in the air forces, but MacArthur's treatment of Australian forces was, at times, comical. He did not understand the Australian army, and his constant meddling not only destroyed careers but also had a negative impact on its effectiveness. Compare MacArthur to Eisenhower, perhaps the greatest coalition leader in modern history. Polite, humble, diplomatic, and always willing to respect the capability and experience of his subordinates, Eisenhower forged an Anglo-American alliance that would successfully complete some of the most difficult operations ever seen in warfare. In reality, had the Philippines been transferred to the Central Pacific area, there is no reason at all why an Australian general could not have served as Supreme Allied Commander Southwest Pacific, as the majority of the forces deployed to mainland New Guinea and the Dutch East Indies all throughout the war were Australian. Indeed, once MacArthur no longer required Australian forces, he simply discarded them, as can be seen in 1944. Even if it made sense to appoint an American general, if only to ensure that the theatre was not neglected by the combined Joint Chiefs of Staff, there were far better choices than MacArthur. What was required in this theatre was not a flamboyant former press officer who could, to be fair, come up with brilliant operational plans, but rather a general who could work well with allies. As the Australian Army had shown all throughout the war, as long as it was supported with moderate levels of air and naval power, it was more than capable of defeating the Japanese in both New Guinea and the Dutch East Indies. Its generals were more than capable, its organisation was more than capable, and its fighting men were more than capable. There really was no need to burden the Australian Army with a commander like MacArthur. Nonetheless, the campaign was not over for the Australians at Kokoda. Before them lay the last bastion in all of Papua, Buna. The Japanese base had been turned into a swampy fortress. In one of the most hellish battles of the Pacific War, the 7th Australian Division, along with their American brothers of the 32nd, would have to root out one Japanese bunker after another, often in waist-deep disgusting swamp. The Battle of Buna and Gona had its own unique form of hell, and every inch gained there would be paid for in Allied blood. It was in that swampy hellhole that the South Seas Force would make its final stand, and the Japanese presence in Papua would be finally annihilated.